Okay, so in the previous video, we discussed culture and we've discussed how there was this growing baby boomer population and population within the United States that was leading to this growing consumerism and things like that. During this video, I want to look at how does that culture change and then lead to a revolution, particularly within race groups in the late 1960s, right? So I just want to put this into a global context first before I sort of hone in on the United States. Across the globe in the late 1960s, there is a huge amount of revolution that occurs in many different cities and countries in Europe and other parts of the world, right? So let's just sort of put this into a global context. So in the United States, in Europe, right, you have particularly in Czechoslovakia, the former, well, I guess in 1968, it was still a communist country. You have a demand to start having access to Western goods. And one of the things that occurs there is that you have this massive revolution against the old communist guard. Particularly led by students, right? So by 1968, you have, let's say, if they're college students, 20-year-old college students, revolting against the control of the communists, right? They want access to Western goods. And again, part of that baby boomer generation we discussed earlier. In France, in Paris, you have revolutions um, against Charles de Gaulle, the president of France at the time. So there's all these revolutions occurring across Europe. Britain, you have revolution riots happening there. It's universal nearly. When we start looking at the United States, however, that certainly doesn't change, right? So one of the things that happens in the 1960s in the United States is obviously, and I talked about the sort of baby boomer culture, I talked about the counterculture, mentioned Woodstock. When we talk about race, that becomes huge in the 1960s, right? So starting in the 1940s, well, one of the things we talked about earlier was the Harlem Renaissance and the beginning of this understanding of sort of what we might call a class culture or a race culture. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Now we're going to be moving into the 1930s. That population, African Americans, right, have the Great Migration, and all of these things are still continuing. Now, when we get to the 1940s, World War II happens, but it's not until the end of World War II that the army is desegregated. So African Americans and whites would fight in different units in the Second World War. Now it gets desegregated, and then we get into the 1950s. So starting in the 1950s, you have a more concentrated event of African American freedoms occur. And that is the important thing to notice, right? It's important to see here that civil rights does not start in the 1950s. But what happens in the 1950s is that it gains new momentum. So I'm going to move this up here. In the 1950s, you have renewed momentum for civil rights. And you have the people on the bottom, right? So you have obviously Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X as two of the major leaders in this fight. There are others, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and others who I'm forgetting. But anyway, this peaks with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And obviously, Martin Luther King played a huge role in that with his I Have a Dream speech. Now let's just talk about the historical portions of this, right? African Americans obviously had been slaves in the United States up until 1965, with the ending of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment. But it's the passage of the 15th Amendment, which occurs in the 1870, that leads to voting rights, right? So the 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote to all people without prohibitions based on race. However, the South and some northern states had become very creative in restricting that, right? So through different types of laws, whether that's things like the a literacy test asking to read parts of the Constitution or the famous grandfather clause. If your grandfather had voted in the 1960 election, you were allowed to vote. Well, African Americans obviously were not allowed to vote in the South, particularly before 1960, well, 1970. So they obviously had not voted. Or a poll tax. So a poll tax would be a prohibitive tax, a tax, a money payment that African Americans would not be able to pay. It would be prohibitively costly. So you have these different things that were used by the southern governments and some northern governments to prohibit the right to vote to African Americans. That continues through the 1900s into the 1960s in terms of school segregation. In the South, school segregation had occurred to keep white students away from black students, African American students, and other students. Well, in the through this period, right, the reason for that, or at least the recommendation for that, was that the sort of needs of the students were different. However, what this also leads to is massive amounts of busing, students who would be living in one portion of a county having to be bused to another portion of the county to receive education. It would be prohibitive on certain groups of students, or certain classes of students. And that becomes significant when we move to 1954. So in 1954, you have a case brought before the Supreme Court that had been fought its way up through the different courts with a whole bunch of different people bringing the lawsuit, right? So we know the court case as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. However, Brown is just the first alphabetically. There's other people that are part of this lawsuit. Now it goes in front of the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, they are arguing that, I should say, Brown's lawyers are arguing that what is being done here is prohibitive and damaging to young African American students. And what you're having happen as a result is hurting these people, hurting these young African American students. And it's saying on another portion of this that these schools are separate but equal, established in Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1790s. 1890s. But they're pointing out that the schools are not equal. They're separate, but they're not equal. And the Supreme Court overturns laws that allow for the separation of races. However, two parts of that become important. First, this ends what is called de jure segregation. So de jure segregation is of law, de of jure law, meaning that legally people can't be discriminated against anymore, can't be segregated anymore. However, what happens is de facto segregation. Communities are typically rather homogenous. There are African American communities, there are white communities, there are Latino communities. So what you've done now is by moving segregation or prohibiting segregation, you now are getting rid of the legal segregation, but moving it more to community-based. So one of the famous examples, particularly in 2020, in the 21st century, is that New York City schools are one of the most segregated school systems in the country. And you wouldn't expect that. But the reason is that communities tend to be very segregated, and not legally, just how people live. And as a result of that, you have, and other reasons, access to schools and things like that. But as a result, you have a very large segregated population. Just how it happens. Again, that's de facto, just of fact. One thing I do want to point out is that when you look at the document, which we'll do in just a few moments, they use actually real sociological arguments for separating people as being illegal. The Supreme Court does. So the Supreme Court talks about how this is damaging to the to the psyche of, I guess it's psychological, to the psyche of African American students, and it makes them feel inferior, which is a great argument, but however, just one that the Supreme Court hadn't really used before. Then famously, you have the Selma riot, or not even riot, Selma March in 1965, where you have people, protesters marching over the Pettus Bridge. And this is a huge event because of it's televised, right? People are seeing these events for the first time of real massive discrimination against populations, right? For Northerners who maybe don't see the violence towards African Americans, now it's being publicized, it's being put on the news, and people are seeing it for the first time. Again, that's really the power of journalism in all of these ages, right? It's the idea that people are seeing these unadulterated, unscripted, unedited photos, and it's really bringing these events into people's homes. This all culminates most famously with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed by Lyndon Johnson, who's pictured on the bottom of the screen, and the purpose of this law is to prohibit discrimination within the United States, or at least that's the goal, right? So you have the Voting Rights Act comes in 1965, but this law is attempting to stop discrimination of African Americans and other groups of protected individuals, women and others. Okay, so I want to look at a couple documents before I sign off here. In the previous video, I had discussed Levittown and its racial discrimination. So I found this document that I thought is interesting. It talks about Levittown's racial treatment rights. So this is the exclusion clause in the Levittown contract. So you can see that it's the premises to be used or occupied by no other person other than the Caucasian race, white people. Let's we'll come back to that document in a second, right? So then we have the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech. So this document, much longer document, a larger speech given in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. However, what I do want to point out here is that what he's asking for is that people are considered equal, right? I have this dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation that will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? And all of these events, again, this very famous speech, which I'll ask you to read for tonight, is asking America to live up to its true self, right? And that's where he starts with this first sentence: "I have a dream that this nation will rise up and live out its true meaning as created," right? One of the things that King is trying to do, at least, is trying to make people understand that America is not living up to its true potential. And that's really what the goal of the civil rights movement was to be, right? That America could be better. And then I also am giving you the Brown versus Board of Ed, a portion of the decision. And again, this is the part that I want to point out where they use sociological and psychological data, right? This idea that education is so important to the humanity of people, but we are sort of failing by doing this. All right, so I hope that this video is helpful in showing you the change, the revolutions that are occurring, and access to rights that are being granted in the 1960s.